Hello and welcome to the One Question Leadership Podcast. This is Jill Bodensteiner, Director of Athletics at St. Joseph's University. As leaders, it's really important that we're clear regarding our goals and our vision and how those integrate into the greater university goals. We also need to collectively create a strategy and a culture that are going to help us reach our goals. This is an evolving exercise that requires an openness to continuous improvement. That's why I follow the One Question Leadership Podcast, because I love learning as much as I possibly can from my colleagues that helps me be the best that I can be. So my message for the day, keep learning, keep leading.
Greetings, this is Ty Brown and welcome to the One Question Leadership Podcast, where we highlight executive and organizational leadership. Be sure to follow us on Twitter at 1Q Leadership. Our guest today is Matt Caruso. Matt is currently the Acting Director of Athletics at Kean University. Greetings, Matt. Thanks for joining us.
Ty, thanks for having me. Thanks for giving me the forum to talk to you today.
Yes, sir. Now, Matt, you've been in that Acting Director of Athletics position since July of 2019, but at Kean, you previously served as the Deputy Chief of Staff to the President. You were the Director of the Student Center, and at one point, you were also Kean University's spokesperson. Essentially, you've been there for 17 years. But if you would call it 21 years if you include your time there as an undergraduate. So you have a healthy knowledge of the university, healthy knowledge of the inner workings from the top level all the way through to students. So I think you'd be a good person to have on right now.
Yeah, definitely. It's in my blood. I'm a proud graduate of the place and have worked here most of my adult life directly for Dr. Farahi, President Farahi, most of that time.
Right. Well, I'll say this in terms of the current environment, you being acting director of athletics, the times couldn't be any more unique than they are now with this coronavirus situation. Looking at the timeline of things, right? The last week, a whole bunch of changes in sports, specifically college athletics. Carthage College, I think, was probably one of the first colleges to move, prevent their soccer team from going to Italy. But between Chicago State, Johns Hopkins, and you at Kean University, those four schools were the first in all divisions of college athletics to make some form of adjustment resulting from this situation. I want to talk to you specifically about Kean. You guys decided to suspend travel for the spring break competition trips that were for baseball, softball, men's and women's lacrosse, and men's volleyball. Walk us through the decision process, the communications process from the president, the AD, the conference, the staff, the coaches, the players, and the university as a whole in making that type of decision.
Okay. Actually, when first I had gotten a text message from my Vice President Brandon here, who I report to, I was on a plane flying back into New Jersey. So he sent me a message that said, come see him and talk to him about the spring break trips. And I had just thought maybe I'd forgotten a travel form or something along those lines.
Right.
Because this is still early on when, there wasn't too much news being made about the coronavirus in terms of how it having this kind of effect. But I knew we had pulled back and brought back some of our students from our study abroad program in Italy a few weeks earlier. So I had a question in the back of my mind. And then I went to see my vice president, and he basically told me that, the president and he had talked and that they were going to shut down these spring break trips. And, I could tell by the look in his eyes and that it was serious, that it really wasn't open to debate, which I really didn't question all that much, because when I first went to work for Dr. Fry, he had given me 3 rules, and number 1 was do what's right for the kids. Number 2 was do what's right for the university, and number 3 was don't embarrass them. So I knew he was operating under those guidelines when he made that decision and did it with the cabinet. And ultimately, it's something you couldn't counter. He thought he was doing what was right in the best interest of the kids, and really had no argument against that. So at that point, then I have to go and really just start meeting with my coaches and talking to the players and everything else. So that's what I did. I went and reached out to the coaches, and just, I had 2 of them that were in the middle of practice. I had 1 on the road for a game, and I had 2 that had left the campus for that day. So I was scrambling around trying to get word to all these coaches as quickly as possible. And as you know, news definitely travels fast these days. And, if I could have done it a little bit differently, I would have organized it a little bit better. Because, again, I had some coaches telling their teams, while other coaches were, again, playing a game or another one was off campus. I made sure to speak to all of my coaches directly first, I did that, but in terms of coordinating and letting the teams know that night, because word was going to spread quickly, the coaches had reached out. So, it's something that word filtered out pretty quickly. And, the next couple of days just were all about meetings and talking to the teams and explaining the situation. So I did my best to meet with each of the teams and talk to them and explain to them the decision making process, why it was made. It was in their best interest. And we took a lot of heat for it here. We had a local radio station making fun of us, and lots of criticism that we were overreacting. And the players were listening to that, and they had some concerns and some questions, but I tried to talk to them and let them know. How the coaches take it? The coaches were great. I mean, you could tell they were disappointed. I mean, we're a D3 school, so in order to go on these trips, they have to do fundraising. They're working all year. They're travel agents and doing logistics and everything else. So it was a lot of time and effort that they had to go through. I remember the last coach that I talked to was Coach Iavero of our baseball team, who is, he's meticulous as they come. And when I went to see him, he was walking out of the gym, and I said, "Hey, Coach, I got some bad news." And the first question he asked me was, "Who died?" Unfortunately, just a few months prior, he had lost one of his best friends and an assistant coach, Jack Nagy, just a great man who meant a lot to the program. And I could tell, just talking to Coach in those first few minutes, that we were going to be okay, because our team and our staff, has the right priorities. And then they immediately just kind of got back to work and said, "All right, well, what can we do?"
Matt, one thing you mentioned there, when you walked up to Coach Ivera, he asked you who died, right? That's immediately giving you perspective. This is not the worst thing in the world, but it is a serious situation. And that had to help with the conversation. Talk to me a little bit about that.
His reaction was everything was in perspective at that point, because, again, when you suffer a loss like that, it does put things in perspective.
In terms of the conversation with your coaches and wishing you could have organized it better, let's not hope that something like this happens again. But tell me about how you would handle it from this point forward if you have to make that kind of news to multiple different personnel, multiple different staff, multiple different players. What would be the first couple steps you would take if you were to do it over again?
Well, I mean, it's just a good point, because the next morning, Coach Acker, our softball coach, came in. She said, "Can I talk to you for a minute?" And sat down, closed the door. And, she let me know she was disappointed, because she wasn't able to. Some of her players got wind of it from some of the other players on other teams. I mean, they talk quickly. So, I mean, if I could have, I probably would have just told the coaches, "Hey, listen, let's get on a conference call tonight at 8:30. I got some bad news to share," that kind of a thing. But I mean, we were literally a day or two away from traveling. And in my mind, I didn't focus enough on my coaches. I didn't focus enough on the players, on the human beings that this was affecting. I was trying to get answers to all the other things that were coming next. Well, can we practice? Can we play? What happens to this? Reimbursing people, parents that had paid for trips to go watch their kids play down in Florida or in California. And I just needed to handle first things first, and really just kind of follow those rules that Dr. Farahi talked about. I mean, you just spoke to Coach Amaker recently, and I'm going to steal this from him. He said, "In times of uncertainty, you have to rely on principles and people." And that first principle, do what's right for the kids, was the most important thing. So I'm not afraid to admit when I'm wrong, or when I could do things differently. I really wish I could, and if I speak to people, and again, this is such a unique kind of time and circumstance that things happen so fast. But it's important to slow things down as much as you can, and really focus on the people that are being affected by this first and foremost.
Right. Well, you got the message to them. I believe everybody understood after a while, just like Coach Amaker said. They caught a lot of flack in the beginning, but in the end, everybody understood, okay, this absolutely was necessary. You mentioned the baseball coach, you mentioned the softball coach, and at that time, they were nationally ranked, right? They were doing pretty good. So now, the news breaks to them. They hear it. One coach has pretty good perspective. The other coach wishes probably would have handled it a little better, but in the end, they probably respect what you've done, the leadership you provided. Talk to me about the response of the guys and the gals on those teams in terms of being, one of them, I guess softball was undefeated. Men had only lost one or two games. I mean, the baseball team had only lost one or two games. And how did they kind of react, as time progressed? to that announcement?
Yeah, I mean, it was incredible. So this is, and so much has happened over the last week and a half since this came down. I mean, we're not even at 2 weeks now for when the spring break trips were canceled. We had an early spring break, so that was a move that we made because we had that early spring break according to our academic calendar. But the teams were tremendous. Again, they took the news, they took it in stride. They were upset. But then when I had met, especially with the baseball team, coach asked me to come in and talk to them, and I said, guys, listen, here, you got 10 minutes to vent, to shout, to complain. I won't take it personally. I won't hold it against you. And every single question that I got from those players and the team, but were more about the rest of the season. Okay, like what does this mean for us? That kind of a thing. And it speaks to that team and their commitment and their focus. Again, losing their coach, someone who was a grandfather figure to a lot of them. I went to one of the memorial services for him, and watching these tears roll down these kids' faces as they're getting back on the bus. And they were playing this season in his honor, and now all of a sudden that is in jeopardy. And all they wanted to know was, is this going to affect everything else? And at the time, I was honest with them. I said, listen, everyone is going through this. We don't know exactly. It is a fluid situation, but you need to stay mentally tough and focused on what your true task is. I mean, this team was approaching this season the way the Yankees did under George Steinbrenner when, a World Series or bust was kind of the thing. Like, they had one goal in mind to win it all. And in softball, just, Coach Acker took it great too. She just had the courage to come in the next day and tell her boss, hey, I wish you had done something differently. And I love people like that. Yeah, oh, absolutely. Definitely don't want yes men and women, working for me. So softball, again, like you said, they're undefeated at this point. I think they're up to 11th in the rankings. They have one of the best players in the country, in Carolyn Ratty. And now all of a sudden they're losing a quarter of their season. And they had the same type of worries and goals after the initial frustration and disappointment of not being able to go play and not be able to have that last kind of trip with their team. I'm focused on the seniors here, but it does affect everyone. They just wanted to know what was next, and they operate under the premise of control what you can control. They got back down to work. So, March 3rd, their spring break trips are canceled. March 4th, they're finding out, okay, well, we still have to figure this out. We got to scramble and schedule makeup games. The coaches are working on that. The kids are asked to come back to practice or to play games like nothing ever happened. And that's basically the way they operated for a good week, up until late last week. Sorry, late this week.
Shows the athletics mentality, right? Which is why both you and I, well, and you've been in it, 9 months now, like working in this industry. It's kind of what I wanted to ask you about that, working in athletics, right? It's been July 2019. You were deputy chief of staff to the president. You were over the student center there. You were at one point the spokesperson for the university. You find yourself in this role as the acting director of athletics. I wonder about some of your thoughts when you were appointed to the position and how your thoughts have evolved now that we're in this current situation.
I did a radio show here on campus shortly after I was appointed with a few of our students that run the radio show. And one of them asked me a fairly good question. He said, not having a background in athletics administration, do you think it's helped you out? And it's the first time I actually thought about it that way, because the first time I met with the coaches, I basically asked them, I said, how can I help? I'm a big believer and proponent of servant leadership and doing things, and working for other people, not the other way around. And I consider my coaches and my SID and head athletic trainer, they're my experts in their areas. And I really wanted to just figure out ways of helping them out to get to where they wanted to achieve their goals and accomplish their goals. So, and especially with a situation, fast forward 8-9 months later, this situation, I mean, this didn't come down to athletics. This was about managing crisis management and really talking to people and making the best decisions and making sure that you're making decisions that are smart and that are protecting the best interest of our student athletes. So, his entire career, I've always known President Farahi to put the students first. He always refers to, and I've taken this on myself, is the students as his kids. So, I'll call my kids all the time, and I absolutely love them. As director of university relations, my first call when we had to do a photo shoot or a video shoot or something for the alumni magazine, I always called the coaches and said, hey, I need some players, I need some people for this, because the student athletes are just our best ambassadors we have at Kean University. I mean, I've said it time and again. I tell anyone who's willing to listen that, and I said that even before I got into this position, because of just I know how hard they work, and especially at the D3 level, there's no fame, there's no glory in this. They're not going to be on Sports Center. They're not going to. Most of them aren't going to have a chance to make money or do this as a professional career. And it takes up a lot of their time and effort, but they love it and they just play for the love of the game. And that's something that's always, stood out to me. So that's something that's been big. And, again, so when all this happened, the spring break trips, they kind of took a knockout punch, but they got back up, dusted themselves off, and came back to work. But then I got news that the NBA had canceled or suspended its season. And I said, I don't think this is one we're going to be able to recover from. Yeah, and as soon as that happened, everything started to snowball. So now I'm going back in and telling these coaches and telling our kids that, hey, this is happening, and I'm not sure what's going to happen. And we might have to shut down, athletics operations here for a while, and that's ultimately what we decided. So these kids are they took that punch last week with the spring break trips, and then we hit them with that because things were just moving very fast, and in that vein of doing what's in their best interest, we needed to do and take action. And it's something I do not regret at all. It was the best decision to make, but it was a heartbreaking one for our students.
Yeah, I imagine it was. But in terms of your leadership, you talk about the education of an athletics director, right? I've talked to plenty who say at first year, you have no idea what you're doing. You just got to make it happen. And you talk about the acceleration of your education in the last 2 weeks, right? Last 2 to 3 weeks has been probably a lot for you exponentially in terms of learning. You already had the role of a spokesperson, so you kind of had to manage that type of emergency management thing. But in terms of working with college athletics, you said you had some experience, but being the leader of the department is a little bit different. And it seems like you worked well. I have a saying, Matt, that the key to a peaceful existence is to master the ability to adjust accordingly. And I've had to do that in my life. As athletes, we always have to do it. As coaches, they have to do it in terms of working in administration or whatever job you're in life. The key to live peacefully is to figure out how to adjust accordingly to whatever life deals you. And it sounds like you've done that there at Kean. It sounds like the kids adapted to it and adjusted accordingly. And I believe they probably are happy to have you leading that athletics department there, man. I really appreciate you joining us here on One Question.
I appreciate the time, and keep up the good work.
Yes, sir. Thank you very much. That was Matt Caruso. He's the acting director of athletics at Kean University. And of course, this is Ty Brown with One Question. And keep in mind, the role of a leader is to create and maintain an environment that people want to be a part of. And as always, be better tomorrow than you are today. This episode of the One Question Leadership Podcast is produced by Spades Media Group, solving problems using creative leadership.